So, my name is Stephen Phillips. I'm the director of the Cal Poly Los Angeles Metropolitan Program in Architecture and Urban Design. We run a program here as sort of a satellite of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo here in Los Angeles. I guess we're sort of in the internet world now. And we have a lecture series that we run at the Helms District Design Center, part of the Helms Bakery. And we are continuing online through these Zoom webinars for the next couple months. We have scheduled an event every Thursday at this time. So probably some things about us. San Luis Obispo has the big campus, and we are about 30 students. They're here in the gallery. They can all say hi if they want. And then I know we have basically studios, theory. We have about 5 faculty. Pavel Getov's with us at the moment. We also have Sarah Hearn teaching in our program. We've had Gia Gu, Alex Maymind, Teddy Slowick, and also Ismael Soto, who all teach with us in our studios. So it's a lot of fun. We also have a bunch of fellowship programs and scholarship programs, and we have a internship component where the students go in offices every Tuesday and Wednesday full-time, and about 30 different offices all over the city. So we've been here about 10 years, and we've been running a public event series, and so we're excited to continue this in Zoom land. And maybe I should just mention very quickly our sponsors. Our sponsors, of course, Angela Anthony over there at the Helms Bakery Design Center. Thank you, Angela, for always supporting us. And then we have our scholarship, fellowship, and award and event sponsors, HMC Architects, Morphosis Architects, Girian Partners, Co-Architects, AC Martin, Theater DNA, Boltaup, Art Reprographics, and we get lots of media support from LAEIA and the KCRW DNA with Francis Anderton. So tonight, super fun, very excited. We have Jenny French and Anda French, sisters. I guess I met Anda over there on the East Coast at some Yale events and Princeton events and Harvard events. Anyway, super cool. I guess there's some familiarity and all of that, and super excited by their work. Really, really enjoy it and love that it's sort of the new exciting generational work that's coming forward. So we're going to run tonight's event. They will have a lecture for about an hour, and then we will open it up to a Q&A to all our attendees, to all those in the participants in the gallery. These are our students and faculty members, and they'll stay muted, and then I will disappear into mute land too. And then if you have a question, you can write it out in the Q&A section down on your screen, and we can see that. Also, you can raise your hand if you want to speak, and I can bring you out to speak in the Q&A. If you have your video on, I believe you'll actually might be able to show, and I can add you in or not. It might just be a picture. Anyway, we're going to try to keep on time. So French 2D is a Boston-based architecture studio founded by Jenny French, MArch Harvard Graduate School of Design, and Anda French, MArch Princeton. Their intimate knowledge of Boston, where the sisters were born and raised, allows their close practice to be both deeply engaged and able to work critically with local issues of housing, public space, history, and identity. French 2D works on housing and mixed-use projects with a focus on strange housing types that combine familiar ideas of home with radical organizations and typologies, found in their co-housing and micro-housing projects. The practice also works on civic installations and exhibitions that call upon the domestic to bring people together for familiar rituals in unfamiliar spaces, found in serial dinner parties, yay, fuzzy bartering environments, and outscaled dresses. Some of my favorite work there. Jenny and Anda's interest in hybrid models that exist between practice and academia has been the catalyst for their practice-based research and advocacy. Jenny is an assistant professor in practice at the Harvard GSD, and Anda serves on the board of directors for the Boston Society of Architects, where the pair organized the recent Now Practice Now series, exploring emerging modes of practice. French 2D was named as Architectural Record Magazine Design Vanguard winner in 2019, The firm has been featured in Domus, Metropolis, the Architect's Newspaper, and as Architect Magazine's Next Progressives. French 2D was a 2013 MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program finalist and exhibited at the US Pavilion of the 13th Venice Architecture Biennale. Please welcome me and our group, Cal Poly students, in joining Jenny and Onda French. And I guess if there's clapping, we don't get to do that like we used to. There's visual clapping. There we go.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's really a pleasure to be invited by you, and we are sorry that we're not there in person. And we would love to be in LA right now, and not in our own living rooms, which are just a few blocks from each other. So I am Jenny French. This is my sister. And as Stephen has mentioned, we have a small practice in Boston. And I'm also an assistant professor in practice at the Harvard GSD, where I teach in the core studio sequence. And so that means I've been teaching the MArch program with students in their first semester, as well as in their last semester of the core, where we focus on housing projects.
And you've been Zooming it up lately for studio.
I've been teaching Zoom Studio for 3 weeks now.
Yeah. So that would make me Onda French. So I think that the best way to get into our work is to talk a little bit about how we work. So we call our firm a collective, and we usually describe our process as a close practice. And of course, we're close in many ways. There's the family relationship. We also literally are 4 blocks from each other, as Jenny said. Our office is a few blocks away. It's closed right now. And the local is a big part of our practice as well. It's important because it's influenced models of participatory design that we've used in residential and civic projects. And we sort of work also on experimental objects that you'll see. So partly because of the hybrid process that we have in inventing our work together and sort of hive mind that we work with, we're very interested in working through multiple perspectives in architectural design and exploring collectivity. So you'll hear that a lot. When we talk about collectivity, we talk a lot about consensus. We think it's important, but that it must be understood that consensus does not mean that you have to see something in the same way. We're much more interested in the fact that 2 people can look at the same object, but they don't have to see the same thing to agree that the object has value. So here are a few of the kind of objects and collectives, design collectives that we're going to get into.
Great. So we would sort of argue that we're in a cultural moment in which collectivity is constantly being called for, but it might also be misunderstood, right? So in our kind of unique position as 2 sisters who are running an architecture practice, we see ourselves as a kind of proto-institution, a smaller version of working together and seeing and making collectively. So basically that means we can work to scale that kind of collective out through objects, buildings, and the city. And we're going to try to get at this kind of making collectively with a story.
Okay, so we like to start by talking about this guy. The artist Lucy Raven is written about director André Detasse, who lost his left eye in a childhood accident. So in 1953, Detasse directed the 3D horror film House of Wax, starring Vincent Price. The studio allowed him to direct it with one condition, and that condition was that he could not wear his eye patch when he was on set. And we can assume, particularly in the 1950s, that there's a sort of studio fear that the public would dismiss or mock a 3D film that was made by a man who himself couldn't see in 3D, right? That you don't have stereo vision with only one eye.
This is one of the first 3D films ever.
Oh yeah, ever, exactly. The artist Lucy Raven's interest in this lies in, quote, the tension between the mechanically constructed depth of the 3D film and the psychological and perceptive plays found in the film. So we're interested in the same set of the same set of conditions, but architecturally. We're also personally drawn to the story because Jenny and I are both, just like the top, stereo blind. We don't wear an eye patch, but we really only see out of one eye each. So for Detasse, this without this is problematic. here we're talking about the stereoscope, which employs two views at a calibrated distance apart and is meant to approximate stereoscopic vision. So what many of the people watching this right now probably have that allows you to perceive depth. So partly because of our condition, partly because our interest in our particular architectural interests, we're not really interested in the stereoscope. Instead, we're interested in collective vision. So the accumulation of multiple viewpoints, probably best embodied in this image, this sort of funky image of Auguste Furman's Kaiser panorama of 1890. It engages not just with a single viewer, but produces multiple points of believability and consensus.
So thinking about this is an image from Lucy Raven, that we actually find a kind of affinity in our architecture to this multimedia work. And this is from a moving image piece called Curtains. And this video installation, it shows the breaking point of the anaglyph, and the anaglyph is literally the blue and the red film, like the glasses you see when you go to a 3D movie. And the image is reaching this point where it's no longer a smooth illusion, but it instead cleaves into two simultaneous figures. So we kind of argue that you can think this image while you see it. And similarly, our exploration in our office relies on our ability to reconstruct and find vision in a view that's actually impossible for us to see without depth perception. And so we see, strangely, a strong similarity between this conceptual and formal break in the video where the 3D view breaks with the conceptual and formal break in these two statues, which are these winged lions that guarded an Assyrian temple in Nimrud. And what's weird about this is that this animal actually has 5 legs that you see right there.
Yep, there we go. Sorry, my image is on delay. So these creatures are curious, but they're not unbelievable, right, for having the extra leg. So it's really a double bas-relief that produces a kind of partially engaged sculpture that we're really interested in. So as a result, what's encoded in the object itself are multiple frontalities, multiple ways of reading it simultaneously, and our understanding of, we get a little bit into this, but of perception and cognition play a really crucial role in the way that we anticipate what we're going to see, and then we reassess what we assume we're looking at in this object as we sort of move back and forth. And this is the moment where we think architecture can learn to capture collective vision. So to move our work forward, we sort of challenge smoothness by forcing the simultaneity of two things, always at once. And sort of what does that mean to see this and this at the same time is the question that we're always asking.
And we like to think about this dual reading maybe as embodied by this self-portrait of a single person, Egon Schiele, from 1915, where we kind of read seeing two sides of a personality, the earnest and the devious at the same time. Or if we think about architectural representation, maybe it's best understood as what you all may have done, an unrolled elevation and plan drawing from stereotomic projection. And again, just to emphasize this, it's important to us because, as we said earlier, we only really see out of our right eyes and don't have depth perception. And we'll get to probably the project reasons why this is also becomes relevant.
Usually you don't see a picture of us at the same time that we have a picture of ourselves up on the screen. So sorry for the doubling. So, but basically what we're trying to get at is that we rely on the doubling of our eye problem as sort of just enough distance between us and our two right eyes, which are our good eyes, to construct our architectural and our intellectual projects. So it becomes a sort of, it's a tool, but it's also a bit of a metaphor to work through things. And so by focusing on this and this, we continually come back to the issue of collective seeing and reading and making and all of these sorts of ways of working through projects.
And so how does this manifest in what we make? It means that we love things that can purposefully deny a single reading. And so here, this is an image from our MoMA PS1 Young Architects finalist for an installation in the courtyard. And this project really for us was arguing for inequality between these kind of white set pieces, which were covered in white astroturf, and the human inhabitants that you see on the screen. And we really read this as a kind of simultaneous view of subject and object. And so for us, our response to the brief, which is asked for some kind of partyscape in the courtyard, denied that the installation should be an object, as many of the kind of winning proposals have been. And instead, it sort of argued that the courtyard could be an object by lining it with our installation, and therefore the party at the center. And so embedded in this reading is that you can never really get a critical distance from the installation, but instead you're immersed within it. But you're also sort of confronted by an infinite number of tableaus or vignettes. And these vignettes are drawing from familiar forms that are kind of purposely disrupting scalar readings. And so here you see our process of using images of mountains or forests or caves, and kind of abstracting them in scale, only to find, you know, the scale of the human figure standing next to them. So we sort of see this installation as both a creature and an environment. And we think it kind of works in that way, both as character and backdrop. And these are just some
and there
of
are a
the
number of pieces, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Good. See, when we're not in the same place, unfortunately. No, I was just going to say that there are a number of pieces here and things that we're really interested in that had to do with atemporality and being in the same place at different times, leaving messages. The surfaces were supposed to be about bartering and being able to kind of understand the artist bartering community in Queens at the time. And we're starting to realize that some of the pieces of the project, the non-tactile ones, the kind of delayed remoteness, is actually where we're headed again right now.
Yeah. So recordings would be collected in the installation and then played back as a kind of voice of the community.
Here's just images of the courtyard. Okay. So for our design for 26,000 square feet of permanent graphics scrim that wraps the Kendall Garage in Cambridge, which is a 350,000 square foot garage, we wrestle with the relationship between seeing surface and volume, and also drawing and building. The project is located in one of, I don't know how you would call it, one of the international hotbeds, let's say, of biotech, and it's situated between MIT and then this rapidly changing area of worker housing. In this project, we decided that
Palo Alto.
Yeah, kind of the East Coast Palo Alto is a really good way to describe it. If it was sort of closer, it was like in the middle of LA. Like if you dropped Palo Alto in the middle of LA, would that make sense? Okay. Anyways, so the project is located in one of, so here's the project. This is the site plan of it. We decided that what we needed to do was consolidate the reading of the sprawling structure, which had literally annoyed residents for the last 40 years. It was built in 1980. Everyone who lived around it hated this building. And we wanted to imagine that we could consolidate that into a single icon for the changing context and kind of reflect that. But we also wanted to ensure that we didn't just create a monolithic object at the end of the day. So we argue through this project that the wrapped garage has to be presented as a proto building. We're very into sort of, if we're the proto collective, this is our proto building. It has to be read through the multi-scale articulation of its facade. So in the same way that facades, that urban facades sort of read at various scales and various levels of attention as you move through the city, we needed to sort of think through that. And you can see that the scale reading changes relative to the new plaza, which is facing this famous and intimate art film theater that is located in Kendall Square and has been there for a very long time. That's where the sort of intimate scale wraps around. And then in the upper images, this is where we're facing the biotech R&D space and where these sort of really large buildings are cropping up in this area. One interesting part of this project, you can see Jenny and I have these backdrops behind us. We're really interested in ways in which we use color in our projects, particularly in the graphic projects. But because of the conservative nature, New England nature of this urban context, we weren't able to use the colors that we would have wished. And as based on sort of conversations with clients and city and all these things. So as we reflected on the strange nature of this full-scale drawing that is a building, we invented a way to make ourselves scale figures within that drawing. So we staged all of these photos with our photographer, and we acted as the pieces of our imaginary version, sort of colorful imaginary version of the building that were broken free and transversing the site. The idea here was that a lot of the kind of scale shifts could be highlighted even more by the sort of scale of the pattern on our figures and how we moved throughout those spaces and around the building.
Here you see us walking around in almost filmic quality. Like this is on the top of the garage. All right, so the next project, much smaller, that we're going to talk about is called Outlier Lofts, and it is the project that you are all virtually inhabiting right now.
Yes, thank you for that. I love
Thank
it.
you, very nice. And this is in Charlestown, which is a neighborhood of Boston. And really for us, this is a building that addresses and repurposes a set of frontalities that to us are still two-dimensional. And so this means, you can go to the next slide, that the building really has to perform as a back and a front, right? And the project is on the former site of what was one of the most visible, kind of invisible buildings in the city, and is a project that's just right down the street from our office. And so what do we mean by a kind of visible, invisible building? It was the home of Old Sully's Bar, which existed here for decades, but had no signage, but extreme political power and visibility. It was also the set and a kind of guest star in Ben Affleck's movie, The Town, our Hollywood reference here for you guys. And this building is strange because it hangs off of the edge of the neighborhood and had a nondescript front and an illegally expanded kitchen into a public easement. So the back of the site, however, opened to a sweeping view of all of downtown Boston. And basically also to this very iconic bridge, the Zakim Bridge, seen in almost all photographs of the city, which you see on the right image here. And so here you see the building kind of with its former back, kind of addressing the new skyline. But 100 years ago, this back was actually the front of two row houses. And it was the sort of witness to a canal, an industrial canal, as well as a series of potato sheds when potatoes were being shipped down from Maine. The structure lost its third floor in a 1960s fire where potatoes set on fire, literally.
The Great Potato Fire of Boston.
Great Potato Fire, it's called. There's a little memorial in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And then after that, the bar existed until 2017. So for us, we were really interested in kind of collecting and conjuring the past lives as a kind of act of collective preservation, which is admittedly radical in the context that we're in, which is a very sort of historic, straight-laced view on preservation. And so the pressures on this figure are kind of not just formal, but again, they're ideological. So really among the neighborhoods of Boston, which is already conservative, Charlestown is kind of known for its stranglehold on building styles and historically appropriate responses. So for us, emphasizing plausible preservation over the realities of its agglomerated history, which we were much more interested in.
So the result of our kind of work of combining these issues of the corner and bas-relief and double reading, and I apologize if you hear my 4-year-old in the background, it's a new world. So the result here is a building with a surface tension that allows us to fold the object up from 4 disparate readings into one continuous, but important to us, not smooth whole, which underscores its orientation to multiple audiences. The way we've addressed this in the interior speculates on architectural production by misusing representational tools like virtual staging, which is why I'm even more excited that all of you are virtually staged within these photos. It's like really perfect. So this is a rendering technique that's popular in the real estate industry to sell empty homes, basically. And final photographs are inhabited by a cast of the structure's past and future furniture residents. So here's the way, sort of back and forth of working with them. working with virtual stagers, thinking about what was going into these spaces. There's a book, The House of Seven Gables is down here. 3 pieces of furniture, a little bit alive. There you go. And for us, this was a way to be able to also continue understanding and being part of the life of a building that, particularly in the world of speculative real estate, as an architect, you kind of, it sets sail and you never touch it again. You don't really know what happens inside of it. And we like the idea that we could continue to revisit this building and re-inhabit it in different ways. And so that became the kind of project on top of the project for us.
It was kind of fun to communicate with this team in Kiev and have them not really understand why we wanted to do these kind of strange setups. Because
it was like the curtain call at the end. So, yeah. But we sort of developed a shorthand. It was kind of nice, actually.
Yeah. So if we move up in scale again, but to a building that has sort of similar front and side problems. Here we're looking at a 100,000 square foot building on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. And we see this project as the simultaneous conflict of being a kind of small city and a commune. So this 100,000 square foot volume holds 180 compact units, each of which are approximately 350 square feet. And it was completed in 2016 as the first all micro unit or compact unit in the city of Boston, which actually got us involved in a lot of conversations around the city and even more broadly about meeting housing goals, building types, and also a kind of changing even of zoning ordinances around what is an appropriate size unit at multiple scales. And so this project reinterpreted and reoriented an existing 300-foot long 2-story concrete building. So somewhat like the smaller old bar, this instead was a car showroom. And we added 4 additional floors of units, as well as amenity spaces, commercial spaces, and parking. And so when the building was built, it wasn't called co-living, it was called micro-housing. But co-living is probably the thing most akin to it now. And that housing type has emerged in many cities, and prior to the pandemic was just starting in Boston. And if we think about co-living, it's really a type that's focused on increasingly compact units, highly programmed shared space, and these are typically run by a management company. And there's a less emphasis on personal possessions and more on experience. So for us, more than just a fascination with attempting to fit, your entire life into this small footprint in the kind of tiny homes way, we were actually most excited about the shared living rooms and lounges in this project. So, and the way that those rooms could produce a collective domestic space for its inhabitants. And in the context of this brief, we had to load a lot of meaning into these collective image making spaces. And we did this through graphic design that we sort of peppered throughout the entire building. And because the building is a rental property, we were projecting onto a space that would anticipate a community but really didn't exist yet. Oh, you're muted, Anda.
Sorry, there we go. There's a little chaos in my house. We're okay now. So when this project was finished in 2016, we were sort of reflecting on these beginning seeds for us of what was important about the sort of compact housing movement and the sort of social dynamics there. And because we couldn't make this building, the 1047 micro housing, because we couldn't make that building collectively, right? Because it was, though there was a client, it was a developer, and the inhabitants did not yet exist, and they would be fairly transient as a kind of group. We were thinking about what other projects there were in the world that you could significantly make collectively, and how you might be able to do that. And then in a sort of, I don't know, let's call it Kismet way, we found this group, found us, and we found this project, and we kind of started working together on something that is often confused with co-living, but is actually co-housing. a more intensive model, and it's often created for and by its intended inhabitants. And it's lived in for decades to lifetimes. It's a movement that was started in Denmark in the 70s, sort of transported to the US, and there are about 130 to 150 of these communities in the US, but there's a lot more conversation about them lately. So this is our current project, which just broke ground. It's in Malden, Mass, which is in Greater Boston, and it's one of these co-housing communities that is being self-developed, and there are 30 families involved. And we draw on the tension in the simultaneous reading of part to whole for this project. We're really interested in making it more complex by a set of existing and then also projected social relationships that are going to occupy every domestic part of this building, every unit, every common space. There's a kind of equality to the way that the building will be used, even though it has all these constituent parts. So our early position that we took in working on this project was that it has to act as a single house, but it also has to act as a collective set of 30 houses for approximately 100 inhabitants that range from, well, it was 0, so like 1 month at this point, there's a 1-month-old, up to 93. So there's a really wide range. And here, the seeming smoothness of the front, these are some studies that we worked on early. The smoothness of that front of the building is complicated by the back, which reveals the complexity of all of the new domestic parts. And throughout the building, there are multiple levels of shared public and private space. There are shared dining rooms where dinners are created together with groups from 2 up to 100 for the whole group. And those are distributed among all of the individual units.
And so for us, again, thinking about this kind of tension, we had to see this building as reading as a single object. And this is specifically in opposition to the kind of scattering format that many of, as Anna discussed, the 150 or so co-housing communities in the US follow. And this is an image, this is not our image, of a typical model of a co-housing community, a sort of rural suburban one, which has a scattering of single family homes, as well as a large common house, which is the sort of distinguishing factor of these complexes, where shared dining, cooking, and living come together. And frequently that means that, 3 times a week, all of the residents will have dinner together. But that scattering approach was clearly not going to work on a 3/4 of an acre site in Greater Boston area. So to pack everything into a single building, we needed 30 units, 5,000 square feet of common house, ample outdoor space, parking for 50 cars, which was a requirement of the city, not of our clients. They really wanted less, but
they wanted like 10 spots.
Exactly, smashed into one site. So the plans for this consolidated community had to create interwoven relationships between common spaces, individual apartments, and outdoor decks and gardens, and finding kind of moments for different scales of domestic intimacy. And here you see a nook under the front entry stair on the right. It also wanted to find large-scale, cozy public space. Here's the front entry and a kind of dining room shot close up. And these model shots, which if you scroll through a few more, for us became a kind of great explanatory tool for our clients who were not necessarily used to reading floor plans or sections or elevations. But this, which is at quarter scale, instead really allowed them to kind of mentally inhabit their future collective living and dining and kitchen space together.
And I would say that was particularly important because you have most of the people there had been living either in an apartment or their own house. And when they looked at any plan, already if you're not in the world of looking at plans, it's hard to understand scale. But for them to look at the plan and see these living rooms, or the common living room or the common dining room, they were thinking of it as their own living room, their own dining room. And we had to help them understand scale was entirely different, and yet it needed to feel intimate at the same time. So that was a real kind of very interesting process.
We almost wanted intentional scale misreads. Yeah. So as you can imagine, getting 50 to 70 owner occupants into a room to design their own house together is actually a really huge undertaking. And so what we had to do over the last 3 years, actually, that we've been working with them, is invent a set of participatory design models that put at the center of the process the agency of each of these future occupants. And part of this was putting trust in the idea that our clients had the capacity to make these major decisions about their future environments, but that they probably just hadn't been given a vocabulary to name their likes and dislikes in a kind of architecturally native language, as all of you are now developing. Kind of like trying to explain to your non-architect family members how they might lay out a future house. So
here, our project, the process that we had to design sort of collectively built up that vocabulary over time, and it allowed our clients to feel that they had made some of these discoveries, and that when we made discoveries, that they could trust that those design decisions were meant to serve them. So there was an incredible amount of trust that was grown in the process, and we also very much appreciated their decision-making process, where the group balances the many viewpoints with a consensus governing model. So that means that in order to move forward with any decision, if one person is uncomfortable, they can block. And it's understood that blocking something is very serious, but it's sort of like a Quaker meeting. If you are moved to speak, then you speak, and then the group has to stop and work through that and then move forward. And that is actually a really powerful process for design that I think we don't always think through or work through, or not able to always work through. You can imagine that shifting over to the virtual world has been really interesting. This is from our last workshop, which we had to run. I don't know, Johnny, you want to describe what we're doing here? I mean, this is just like practicing for it right at the beginning.
Yeah, this was an 8-hour day over Zoom on a Saturday, which is the other joy, which is kind of fun. But the point of working with clients like this is that they all have jobs and work, and so all of our big workshops are on the weekends and evenings. But here we are practicing how to use a Jamboard to basically like virtual Post-it notes, and this was all a kind of icebreaker of people talking about what they would be doing if they were living in their community at that moment. And this is just an aside. There's Anda's son. This is one of these interesting things for us about the kind of transition to Zoom and seeing all of our domestic realities and our kind of humanity at the same time. I think is an interesting and kind of nice transition. But okay,
I appreciate it.
All right. So at a kind of much smaller scale, we might think about a collective that's constructed around one spatial object instead of within a building. And here we like to reference Judy Chicago, the artist's feminist masterpiece called The Dinner Party from 1979. I believe has been or is currently at BAM in Brooklyn. And basically, Judy Chicago said she got this idea while attending a real dinner party in 1974. And the long and the short of it is that she was sitting among a table of men and women, and everyone was a PhD.
Do you want me to read the quote?
Oh, sure, yeah.
I have the quote here, it's great. It says, "The men at the table were all professors, and the women all had doctorates but weren't professors. The women had all the talent, and they sat there silent while the men held forth. I started thinking that women have never had a Last Supper, but they have had dinner parties." There you go, sorry.
And so, no, I think this is great. So this is clearly a kind of feminist narrative on top of a dinner party scenario. And what we see here on the right is actually a dinner for the people working on the installation at the time. So this has kind of challenged us to ask, can we make an object that pushes intellectual and formal boundaries, like the table on the left, while also trying to construct a real community in real time, like the image on the right? So our response has been this ongoing project. This is the first iteration, and it's called Place Setting. And we see it not as a symposium or a board meeting or a private party. And instead, it was an installation that created a kind of warm but strange environment designed to host intimate dinner parties that were also open and transparent in a civic space. And so this became kind of dinner table and performance. And so here you see in a plan drawing that each meal, it would experiment with a different arrangement of tables and chairs. And so when the party could breach the installation box, or the table legs kind of grow like mountain goats off this ledge, or loosely implied perimeters would allow passersby to be inches from a dinner guest, we could watch as dinner conversations got more or less formal here, or where they would break up or touch on revolution, which kind of excites us.
And so this is an ongoing project for us. It's self-motivated and self-funded, and we have created it with our partner, who's a social scientist, Gabriel Mugar, also my husband. We have very close practice. He's a senior design researcher at IDEO. So this is the first iteration of place setting, and it took place over 4 days on Boston City Hall Plaza during a thing called Hub Week, which is Boston trying to do South by Southwest, but we'll see if that happens, if that works.
So to think about this kind of dinner as performance, we were looking at Da Vinci's Last Supper here in the upper left-hand corner, as well as Rembrandt's etching of the Last Supper, which he adds a small dog to in the lower right corner, from 1634. And so what's interesting about these iconic images of the Last Supper is that they definitely conflict with what we know a Roman table in a triclinium would be, which we see in this etching in the lower left, which instead, dining among guests would happen around a U-shaped table with people reclining on couches. So the kind of bending of the Renaissance banquet table to produce an almost plastic warp here, which is sort of similar to that Roman dining U, is perhaps best adapted by the Flemish Baroque painter Jean-Baptiste de Champagne in the 1631 image of the Last Supper, in the lower right.
So what emerges in those paintings is that it's hard to understand the meal as an object or an environment, and that's something that we wanted to explore in real time. So our installation housed these 4 public meals, and they were all set up with guests from a mix of grassroots and legacy institutions, and the themes revolved around the growing disparity in income in Greater Boston. So we were having these really intense conversations in these sort of semi-public, semi-private spaces, and the idea was to sort of loosely structure the meals around a menu of conversation, while at the same time there was real food, but the menu was about the ways that we could prompt and get people to get quickly well acquainted with one another. So they were sitting on City Hall Plaza with a backdrop of these angled mirrors, and the idea was to encourage sort of sanctioned eavesdropping, and then to create the sort of extension of the table into other dimensions. And then between meals, visitors could sit and listen to past meals. There was ambient noise there. Again, that came back from our PS1 project. Or they could read the notes that were left over, because all of the plates with notes and provocations would stay on the table for the next round. And this sort of built up this language and this conversation. And then one thing that was really important to us is to think about, when you have an architectural project that is an event and doesn't exist beyond the event itself, how do you start to build up, how do you test, how do you make the next iteration of that thing beyond just the photos of it? So we took the audio conversations that were accessible through these multimedia representations. Those sort of underscore the effect of the formal organization of the dinners. So depending on which dinner it was, the tables were organized differently, the conversations developed in different ways as a result. You can kind of read that pattern by listening to the conversations. And then we sort of can test that way. And then you also see at the bottom, so at the top, those are quotes from the actual dinner. And then at the bottom are the follow-up interview quotes. And this is a really important thing about working with social scientists, is that he is a researcher who then went and interviewed people very quickly after having this experience of being at the dinner, and could sort of capture a lot of that information in a sort of post-occupancy model way. But here it was about post-occupancy of the social interactions that happen in the building, not necessarily like, were you warm enough? Were you cold enough? Is the building performing? But so it's a really interesting model that we're sort of looking at now.
We're continuing these experiments. Here is a version really testing the power of the conversation menu and designing slightly strange environments to quickly produce intimacy and vulnerability. And here is a workshop we ran with the Masters of Design Engineering students at Harvard. This was a sort of first week of class where we asked them to randomly split into groups and gave them a kind of Mad Lib style version of a menu, as well as food and drink, and asked them to design a setup as well as complete the menu of conversation and have their classmates kind of play out this small event where they could get to know each other.
And it was really incredible. Within like 10 minutes, you had people telling like their deepest childhood memories to a group of people they had, you know, just met that week. So it was really nice. And there was kind of the playfulness of things like they upended the tables here and created the sort of intimate dinner party versus the group that decided that they would sort of create a corralled cocktail party, and that there were differences in the way that people interacted just based on, you know, these sort of environments that they quickly created. So we've continued to explore the sort of power of those table configurations or configurations in general in some transient and some atemporal participatory models. And we've done that by employing the same techniques of multiple frontalities and vantage points for the table surface itself, right? So here we're sort of looking at this 14th century fresco in Rimini, another Last Supper. We're particularly focused on this right now because of the remote and atemporal aspects of work at the moment. But we're also very interested, I love this, Jenny can describe it a little bit, with the sort of Zoom version of the Last Supper.
This is the Zoom version of the Last Supper with everyone zooming in, all the apostles. So just thinking about what does it mean to have a dinner not physically next to people and maybe not even at the same time, but that produces the collective atmosphere of coming together.
So here is our proposal right now for a table that's a collective space for sharing in real time and remotely. As the table folds up the wall, it creates a projection surface, and we can interact with the projection or after images of people seated before us or at the same time, but projected from above and the side, so that we're sort of occupying that same space together.
We're trying to prototype this with our actual working environments at home as well. So I can see
with our
top
two dining room tables.
Desk. Yeah, exactly, up on the wall. And so this is the sort of the last project that we'll share is that we're also working on objects as a vehicle for sharing, study the effects of slight strangeness and how they would disarm their users, as well as a proto site, again, a kind of testing site for continued work on the relationship between the corner and the bas-relief, or the shallow sculpture and the cast. And so
here is this tea set.
And these tea sets are constructed by folding, much like the project that came out of the old bar building, a sort of series of fronts collided and collapsed onto a kind of Euclidean geometry, much the same way that sculpture that you mostly see from one side has to have a back. We're kind of engaged with this idea of the three-dimensional plastic object producing much more discrete fronts. And in doing so, you see that this teapot now has 3 handles. So we see it as kind of a teapot for multiple users to have to pour tea at once. Or the mug becomes inclined and you have to kind of recalibrate your own ergonomic relationship with how to drink out of it. We've prototyped this with 3D printed ceramic and are kind of working through how at the object scale, this small tea ceremony might have some of the effects that the dinner scale can to produce this kind of quality of playfulness and intimacy.
And then maybe we'll scale it back up.
Yeah. And lastly, again, as we're always sort of questioning scale and misreadings of scale in this idea of simultaneity, here we have it as maybe something that's more like inhabitable or architecture scale. So yeah.
And that's all we've got for you tonight/today. Thank
Yep.
you all for listening. And we'd love to take questions. Oh, did anything pop up, Jenny, in a Q&A? Sorry, I can't see it because I'm full screen.
Not yet, y'all. Hi. Am I on now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool.
This thing on?
I'm not sure if we want to keep sharing the screen or.
Yeah, I'm going to take it off.
I'm
Yeah.
just gonna, but it might be nice to see some pictures at some point, so we'll see how it goes. Cool. First of all, thank you. That was extremely interesting and actually very well composed and organized and clearly healthfully practiced. Appreciate that. It was really interesting, and I have a lot of questions myself. I'm just going to start with one or two, just to get the ball rolling, and then we'll open it up to the students and company. But the first thoughts I started having, I mean, I really respect and appreciate your graphics, and you talked a lot about graphic design, and you have an interest in graphics that you don't really discuss so much in the presentation. I'm kind of curious by the way in which you represent in sort of this, it's kind of a flat pattern. There's something interesting about that, sort of these monolithic color tones and how they kind of relate to each other, but then they become optical. And you get into this optical illusion kind of qualities, maybe with the garage especially, but also with some of the other ways you do things. And then starting to then turn them into these 3D graphics, which are again, very two-dimensional, but then very 3D with your teapots, which I love. And I'm wondering, like, what is it you're chasing? What are you developing? What are you thinking formalistically? Where is this the color tone coming from? The pattern making, the interest as it becomes three-dimensional, but then also challenging our perceptions of 3D, and maybe, yeah, just to talk more about that, because that's sort of your own style.
I mean, I think that's quite a nice summary of all the sort of techniques we're employing. And some of it is explicit as it relates to that trying to make all of you see some of the ways we deconstruct vision and flatness. And that kind of flatness is also related to the abstract qualities of the playful or the cartoonish, perhaps, for us. And so some of the color and the shapes and simplicity are a lot about expressing tone or a kind of attitude or disposition within the work that in some ways has emerged. And we, even as we experiment in kind of different ways, I think is conveying a kind of, I don't know, an optimism or a kind of a strange playfulness is maybe how I sum it up.
Yeah, and I think we both go back and forth between something very personal and then something sort of highly intellectualized. And I think the graphics show up as that place that we are both creating kind of associations. We're interested in the way other people create associations because we have this sort of strange similarity where we can say one word and see the same thing in our minds. And so we're trying to play a little bit with that. And then I think at the same time, there's a kind of, there's a weird wistfulness with a 3D thinking about sort of optical illusions, particularly because I know we both had so many eye tests as children. We couldn't see those magic eye posters. They're always giving us these depth perception tests where I was like, yeah, I see green and red, but I don't see anything else going on. So like there's this kind of funny embedded personal experience that we're like maybe playing out a little bit there as well.
And a kind of stylized worldview that maybe, I mean, Wes Anderson does a good job of this, and it's not saying that we are Wes Anderson, but the kind of defamiliarization of the normal through a few affects, maybe graphically.
Yeah, well, I was feeling that it's very contemporary and is something maybe also generational that's been happening. And we started our lecture series with Jimenez Lai. I was in a group before that as well with Andrew Kovacs. And there is an interest in, and he kept talking about the cartoon and the cartoonish kind of this pop quality that I think gets mapped in a very weird way with postmodernists, and I don't think it has anything to do with anything postmodern really, except that there is a popularity. I don't think it's postmodern at all. It's got its own kind of conversation that's sort of rolling, and I'm excited by that. And I like the way in which you've been kind of organizing, playing, discovering. Very weird with the eye stuff. I don't know how that works in your three-dimensional designs, but some of your graphics are amazing. Like that graphic screen was super cool inside that building. I have now another maybe more weird or difficult question that's kind of been crossing my mind as we all kind of have been seeing what's happening in contemporary society with our the coronavirus, of course, but also what's happened to different communities based on, let's say, density. And that, you know, here in Los Angeles, we're having a bunch of conversations that we've been pushing very hard on high density multifamily living. And that's where we were pushing. And we were getting an enormous amount of kickbacks. Francis Anderson's been discussing it. We're not really sure what's happening, but generally speaking, homeowners are not so interested in that model long-term for condominiums or for housing. There's obviously a real estate problem with it in terms of being, now that we're moving into a recession, and people are going to discover very quickly that owning those kind of properties, they plummet in value quite quickly depending on your neighbors. There's all these things that will start to happen. And so if we think of, let's say, the post-World War II decentralization concept that happened, mainly because they were thinking about creating communities that would be resistant and resilient to bombing, i.e. through redundancies. And that sort of set up a dispersal that kind of destroyed downtown Los Angeles in some ways and made it decentralized. But they planted that kind of conversation everywhere, right? I think there's Peter Gallison or something wrote a really interesting article in Grey Room on that. Now we're in a new society where we're starting to realize, wow, if you're in New York City, there's a density intensity that is challenging on these levels that we don't want to talk about. And a lot of your projects have been pushing on co-housing, collective discourses, collective engagement, and collective personal engagement, which I think we all are very pro. I'm wondering if now you think there's going to be a kickback and that we might move towards that other model that you posed of the outmoded version of co-housing where people have discrete living arrangements, but then maybe come together. Just throwing it out there. It's like, what's happening? Yeah.
It's interesting as a Californian, right, that you don't blame the dispersal on the car, and the kind of suburban home myth, right? So, I mean, to the two of us, maybe there's something about this scale that we like to call kind of extra medium, which is what is something that's not super high packed, dense everywhere, but produces intensity and also viability. I think that the point of metropolitan areas, until we're all telecommuting, is that it is both more sustainable and more economical to try to live more densely, right? But we can't only hold up the two polar opposites of the single family home, which is not possible for so many of us ever in our lifetimes. And then the high density tower is the only options. I don't know. And so in some ways, Boston for us is it's kind of a provincial scale where this middle scale is happening. And the thing that we want to advocate for the most is actually fighting neighborhoods that will only allow single family housing, and think about what is a 4-family house, an 8-family house, a 10, 20, right? And how can that actually produce resilient relationships as well?
I think there are two sort of wildly different examples too that I might use. So in the sort of Boston world, we have this model called the triple decker. I think triple deckers are everywhere, but Boston is sort of a huge part of it was developed that way. And the triple decker was made to be this resilient architectural object so that you could build it, that you had 3 units stacked on top of one another. The idea being that either you live in one unit and you could rent out the other 2, or you could support family, particularly immigrant families who at the time then, if they had family coming over, they might have that extra unit. You could have different generations living in the building. There's a flexibility to that. And I think a lot of the kind of conversation in Boston about density is even taking that model and saying, so what is the one step beyond that that starts to build community beyond just the three units there, but starts to create some resilience across a block or a neighborhood. And that's where we're really interested in sort of the co-housing. The urban piece, I think, is so interesting. I just read this amazing piece 2 days ago that was saying, like, what happened after the plague? What did it do to housing types? And I was really fascinated. I was thinking, well, man, post-plague, so 50% of Europe died in the plague. So after that, you would think that everyone headed for the woods, right, and separated. But instead, what happened over these several decades of the plague continuing to come back is that people found that there wasn't enough infrastructure if you were far out, and that people came in from farms. The feudal system was breaking down at the same time, and you started to find more groupings around shared resource, and because of the kind of horror of what was happening. I do think that's a really interesting sort of model that is not directly applicable, but I think there are ways in which you can't undervalue the need for society and other people and leaning on resource as a kind of thing that may come out of this and may make it a reality.
And in LA, think about like the Blackbirds, right? The Barbara Bester project, right? What does a traditional lot that's suddenly subdivided and can be densified, but not to an extreme extent, that kind of densification might be a very good tool to use.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement that the small lot, which subdivision, which is something happening only in LA City, but it's very, very interesting in terms of almost like we're doing something like that in Culver City, but it's like it's got a row house mentality. So I thought it was interesting what you brought on too. This idea that you can have a much smaller lot, higher density, go up a little taller, but still have your own ownership rights. And the ownership rights are enormously important for one, avoiding homeowner societies, which I think all architects probably never want to be part of a homeowner society because then you can't do what you want to do, right? But also you lock in the value of your objects in relationship to other people, and your real estate values are way too tightly related to other people's financial problems, but also the market and also their design tastes, which we don't really want to do. So I agree with you that I think Barbara Bester's version for LA is kind of a nice one. Patrick Ties does that too. A lot of us actually, it's kind of an interesting model. Can we open up to questions from the gallery? Y'all must have questions, so just...
I see a hand from Ryan.
Ryan?
Go, Ryan. I think you can unmute yourself, right?
Oh, sorry, we had mute on. First, thank you for speaking with us. That was a really great lecture. I thought it was really interesting that you guys have like kind of struck this chord of like exploring different kind of social spaces and like communal, generating this idea of community. What were some other relationships or ideas that you found, discovered, or were inspired by your experiments with like the place setting events that you had?
Well, one was actually supposed to happen a couple weeks ago in LA, which is so sad.
So sad.
We designed a massive tablecloth that was actually wearable, and we kind of like a creature that we hope to roll out in the fall in LA. That basically become a kind of extension of your own feelings and something to connect people literally and kind of in a humorous way. That's one of the things we've sort of the dresses that we made moved us into thinking a little bit about textiles. We have another installation that just opened 3 days before everything shut down at Harvard, which is a gigantic inhabitable wall with chairs that hug you, so that you can sit with friends and be kind of enveloped.
So it'll stay up. So hopefully when everyone comes back, they can.
Yeah.
But I also think that at the larger scale, for architectural projects that we're starting up right now, we have a couple of other projects. It's really trying to figure out how do we collide what our ideas of the domestic are and the vulnerabilities and the kind of closeness and comfort, how do we extend that to the civic space? How do we extend that from an interior community to a larger exteriorized community? And I think that's where we have a couple of more urban design pieces that we're working on right now that I think that trying to cram those two scales together is where we're problematizing right now.
Cool, thank you.
Other questions? Go for it, come on.
Anything.
See a hand.
Yeah, Evan, go for it.
Kurt.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Hi.
Let's let Stephen do it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's all good. Evan, go for it.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, first of all, great lecture. I love it. I really enjoyed the graphics. And so I'm just actually curious in terms of the graphic design for the screen, like when you guys have so much intense like patterning going on, did you guys usually just do it with like the analog ways of overlaying, or do you guys actually also use some kind of computer generation like Grasshopper, or like what is the inspiration of this kind of like, you know, pattern generating? Because I'm really fascinated with it. I would like to like hear from you guys.
So we're talking to you in LA, so we're going to admit that it's all analog in that project. We apologize, I guess. That's like I feel like we're but I think for that it's because that we created a kind of prototypical piece and then scaled it, and we kind of worked in a painterly way. Like that was our sort of brush, and then we moved across working together to create that larger pattern. Though it does start to mimic a lot of sort of algorithmic ways of exploring, yeah, exactly the kind of pattern making. We sometimes start to create, I don't know, Jenny, go ahead. I'm trying to think of, we don't use Grasshopper.
Yeah, it's funny that you ask, because we went to school in the time of Grasshopper and of even of using the processing, like the simple small scale graphic processing. And I think what came out of it for us is actually that the kind of content or the intent was always still controlled at this kind of larger scale. And so for something like that, actually using some of the automation of like array in old-fashioned AutoCAD, and then kind of overlaying and composing and editing was just as fast, frankly. Though it is a massive, in the end, Illustrator file that would crash the fastest computer.
There was another question, right?
Yeah, I had a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go for it.
So great presentation. And I kind of noticed the trend of in almost all your projects, the importance of scale being brought up. And so if you guys wouldn't mind kind of elaborating on how early does scale come into your considerations in these designs? And then what's your process in terms of like how people will read this on the macro scale, you know, and like the site plans versus at that human scale, like on the street block, in the installation, in the project, in the living room. Just kind of what's the thinking behind how one will interpret those scales?
Thank you for your question, and thank you to all of you guys for your really great questions and for your being so complimentary. It's really quite nice of you. It's a great question because I think the questions around scale, right, have to do with these dual readings. I also think it has to do with like questions of the uncanny or the not familiar, and how do we make something just different enough from what we expect to suddenly make us aware of it. So I think that kind of collision of scales is always the intent, which is giving a design object a kind of agency to say, you know, give me a second look, or consider that I am a constructed thing. I didn't just happen naturally. Is that fair, Anna?
Yeah, and I think in terms of the sort of literal process of it, it's one of the few things that we do that isn't shorthand between the two of us. We really do sit down and take a site plan and walk the site and figure out what those kind of scale corridors are and where the weird scale shifts exist on the site. And by doing that, we can then talk to our clients about why we might want to make some of these weird moves, how their site sits very particularly in that part of the city. And I think it helps us then to play a little bit, to have the terms on the table, right? To have the photographs in front of us, to have the site plan, and to really be precise about what we mean by what would be slightly weird or what would be expected in that one part or place.
Who wanted to go next? I think Rayan had a question.
Hi. I was interested in like your guys' discussion on the separation of like co-living and then co-housing, with co-living being more temporary and co-housing being more of the permanent, or taking the more permanent aspect of that. But is there a way to approach integrating the two or mediating them so that they can kind of coexist in the same area?
Yeah.
We
have the exact same thought. Yeah, just come work for us because that's what we want to do. Yeah.
A lot of it is thinking about, you know, if co-living right now is branded as a generational sort of millennial idea, we keep asking people, we keep actually reminding people that millennials are like about to turn 40 and that there's not the same kind of model, right? That they're thinking like, so that in fact, what we're talking about is people whose lives change over time, and that kind of model may work as sort of transient model for anyone who's 25, but how do you work through creating different options next to each other so that you don't necessarily leave, but the typology starts to accommodate? We've been talking about that. We have a few friends who have done sort of really small scale models, or looking at small scale models of doing that, like using one as a kind of rental income that produces and supports the other. Jenny, you were going to say something. Sorry.
No, and I think that's great. I think this kind of question around permanence and community, and I mean, even if you live somewhere for just a few years, your life is always enriched if there's someone who's been there for 40 years and kind of knows the neighborhood and is looking out for and kind of invested in the place. And so we think it's a totally false division that you have to separate out the like age demographics, and in particular, of course, like socioeconomic and like every other degree of the ways in which we kind of self-segregate ourselves, that we think that these housing models can start to mediate some of those.
Some of the earlier challenges with co-housing had to do with buying in and selling out, and how you would manufacture and buy these and even build these kind of constructions, because it didn't quite work for the American model. It worked well for certain European models. And that they used to, there was a lot of people, I think they were, again, the Denmark group, but they also, I was at Berkeley at the time, and they were working very hard and trying to create some co-housing projects. I actually have a friend who ended up going ahead and doing that in her life with her family and their extended families and extended families. It kind of work as long as everybody knows each other, gets along, and has agreed to this on a buying model. You're all talking about a renting model, which is an interesting and maybe a different version of this subject, but also then makes me wonder, there is a problem in our society in not making ownership in a capitalist model that we have available to more people. So the rental model works probably more readily, like people can move out, different ages and different groups. We have something called Park La Brea here in Los Angeles, which is an enormous version. It's like 4,000 people of all different ages coming and going from this massive community, which also has a lot of amenities and things like you're talking about. It's called Park La Brea. Works really well for elderly. It works really well for young people, transient, moving in and out of the city. But it doesn't work well if you want to have ownership and you want to get the financial values that often is how most people find security in the society. I don't know, maybe if you have some thoughts about how that might play into it.
It certainly depends on which social or economic enterprise is managing the thing as well, or organizing it. I think there are some really interesting, co-housing is this very weird pocket, and it's mostly baby boomers, and it's mostly people with progressive values, but also maybe have a different idea of what inclusiveness looks like. And I think there are some groups though that have really put their sort of money where their thinking is. I know that there's like anecdotal stories of there's a co-housing group here in Boston where they always have several of the units that are rentals, but the idea is that they're sort of rent to own and that they help people and they subsidize them. So we visited a few years ago, and there was a woman who had started out renting. She was a single mom. It was a subsidized unit. She started to get to know the community. The community became more supportive. She was able to work more, and then she bought into the community after having been there for several years and building up that equity. And I think that there are those kind of models. That's a private model of a private group of people deciding that this is a task that they want to undertake as a value of their group. I think if you could extend that out to a larger model, it would be incredible. The sort of like rent to own model as a supportive social piece. Without architects getting into politics, I don't know how I do that. Jenny and I talk about that sometimes.
Probably the best example we actually know of is a friend of ours who lives in a large artist co-op in the city, and everyone rents and then can actually also convert some of that into equity owning, and that there's a kind of return on that. So there's maybe you're not buying the entire unit, but you're investing what you can and seeing that as your equity. So I think the kind of hybrid model of ownership and renting, as well as the ability to invest, even if it can't be the value of your unit,
that's
is something
interesting.
we'd like to see. Yeah.
How do you sell out? Like,
so
how
that
do
one
you
is a pure
move?
rental model for the artists. So they're all renting, but Jenny, do some of them? No, they're all rent, but they can buy as much equity in the building as they want, and then they get a guaranteed return on investment at the same time.
Oh, okay,
so you may not be able to,
So they don't actually own their unit. Yeah.
Right.
But then you're still
they are
limited
like
by a management company that's owning this thing, that's managing it.
In this case,
one
it's
is
not a management company, it's a nonprofit. Yeah. So they worked with the city to buy the building. They had been squatting there. It's the kind of classic artist model. But if you look it up, it's called Midway. It's really, I don't know. You guys are probably thinking about thesis projects, right? So it's like, those are the examples.
That's a good one. Another question? Yeah, Liam? You guys have like a way to raise your hand with like this blue hand thing. I don't know how you do it, but anyway, go Liam, ask your question.
So he's muted.
You got to unmute.
Of course, thank you. So it seems like especially with the objects, like the teapot you were showing us and the iterations on a dinner party, like it seems like you're kind of trying to create a conversation piece that then community builds around. So I guess I'm wondering about what came first. Were you always attempting to design for community, and you arrived at this style where you kind of agglomerate pieces of culture into a new collage, or did you have that style first and push it towards this idea of building a community, or how did that work?
You guys have really good questions.
Yeah.
Can I say that? It's like really impressive. I think Jenny might agree with me, which is like, we had those two things for the last, we've known each other our whole lives, right? So we've talked about these things our whole lives, but in our practice, the last like 6 or 7 years, probably 10 years of preoccupation has been, we're really interested in this and we're really interested in this. And it was like a slow kind of turning and finding a way to work them together that didn't seem overly pushed together, that we really had to kind of explore what pieces of each were important to us and how they might fit together. Do you think that's fair, Jenny?
Yeah,
Probably too candid and honest.
No, I think that's how having your own practice works, is that, one reason to have your own practice is having interests or things that you want to pursue that you haven't necessarily seen collide in the way you want them to collide yet. And it's not always smooth, and it's like trying to work time and time again to try to see if you can find some, happy marriage between the things you're interested in. So yeah.
And to be fair, like there is this historical, right? Like we all know the historical debate between like social and formal, right? The autonomous project, the engaged project. And I think the two of us sit in an uneasy place where we don't think that there is a kind of real divide between those, but it took us a long time to figure out which projects could actually operate in both realms.
And I think that's an incredibly important point. Actually, I think this is something that we should all think about, which is that architecture cannot just be separated into like, there's the purely social, and then there's the purely formal that never has to have any social ramifications or responsibility, right? And so like we reject that idea that they're divorced from each other. And I think a lot of other people are having a similar.
I think that's a historically agreed upon discussion in a funny way, like with the Michael Hayes famous article, which often gets misread in its rereading, in my opinion. Like the Doppler effect characters had a very weird way of trying to argue that discourse, when I think we're in agreement that form has social, political, cultural impact, and that's why we use it. But then this is the question that I've been like waiting to ask you guys, because I don't have the answer, but I was hoping maybe you can talk to me about it. What do you think is the social, cultural, political impact and point of cartooning and flat patterning? Like, why the interest? There has to be some cultural politic embedded in it.
So also, just what you described and what you're describing, it's like our lineage is exactly like we come right after, right? Like the sort of Michael and Sarah are like our sort of weird, right? Like that's where we come from. So they crash into each other. We crash into this conversation. And I think the conversation for us is, particularly when we're working with the co-housing group, like what's the most accessible thing first? Where can you get someone to think about what surrounds them in their environment and understand it and pay attention to it? And where does that start to enter someone into a conversation about the effect that one's environment has on their day-to-day life? And so for us, it's way easier to talk to people about the graphics where people are willing to talk about it. They're interested and they'll give an opinion in a way that's very different from the kind of limited dialogue that we'll have with people about architecture as a kind of formal art. And its relationship to them. So it's almost like a dipping of the toe into thinking about environment for us. I don't know, Jenny, as my sort of like first reaction.
I think the reason to do it is to make even more visible the agency of the object or the thing or the place, to influence the way we live within it. And some of that then is about kind of, I don't know, thematic or kind of affect overtones that might be something that is partially intuitive and partially about a kind of disposition, again, that we want these agents to take on. If that makes sense.
Social, cultural, political issues, all of those issues at their base are about emotions, right? And they're how people's emotions are elicited and then play out at those different institutional scales, at different scales, institutionally or informally. And I think there's a lot of kind of ways that studying strangeness and studying affect can get at the kind of the emotions behind our actions and how those things play out. At the same time, really building the stuff is important. Like you have to actually put it out there. So we will build whatever,
what I also was hinting at is like your graphic patterns are three-dimensional graphic patterns, and that if you're suggesting, I mean, my reading is that the cartoon or the popularity of something that's legible, and it's interesting that you say that it's emotionally legible, and it's a way in which you can readily or more readily communicate with your audience, your clients, people, with more succinct or discursive conversation that they can understand. And maybe it's what we can understand too, for that matter, is a mode of operation. It's an interesting one. I'm kind of wondering, like, in your journey, have you found what would be a perfect example of a social, politic, cultural point that's coming across through a graphic that's become maybe a three-dimensional graphic in your work? Would you even be able to describe that yet?
I think a little bit of the garage project and the back to the kind of the conversation around the mediation of scales. And this is to us kind of hinging with what's a kind of unspoken but very visible tension between small scale former working class neighborhood and then these kind of massive quite corporate buildings that have emerged, and somehow allowing that that set of screens to negotiate that weird collision and transition is done through translation there. Yeah.
It's funny, just anecdotally, we were walking the site when it was completed, and it's part of a complex of another building that was built also on the same piece of land, which is like a $30 million lab building. And we were walking through with the city of Cambridge officials, and they asked the owner, who's a big landowner and developer in Boston, so have you gotten any comments, any public comments on the building? What kind of feedback are you getting? They're like, no one said anything about the building. But every person, we've gotten so many comments about the garage. They love the garage. And that's that kind of funny accessibility. Like, you notice something that costs, 1/30th of the thing. That's sort of fascinating to me, and proves a little bit of the point of like what we have attention blindness for and what we do notice and what affects our environment. So that's a way in,
yeah,
I would say.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Any more questions? Yeah. Int, go for it.
Again, like amazing lecture and amazing like slides and everything. I particularly really love your slide that you show the Chicago, like the dinner party, and like the and also like kind of almost like the backstage of it, and how you guys kind of relate that to like your work of the co-housing project, and how it's almost like you guys are almost like giving almost like the authorship to like the people who are actually going to be living there. And I think it's such a like the way, like very unique way of like working versus like almost like, can I say like maybe like traditional project where like you have like a client, like big client that want to like develop this project, and then like they hire an architect to like kind of design like the overall thing. But then when you guys are like actually kind of getting the feedback from like all the people who are actually going to be living there, it's like very interesting. So we just kind of want to ask like, what is like when you guys are working towards that kind of project, what do you think that your role as in like a designer or as an architect kind of changed a little bit? And is there like a balancing out? Because I heard you guys are mentioning about how you guys have to like put almost like a lot of trust in like these people to kind of like design like their own units and whatnot. So I'm just kind of wondering how you guys kind of almost like work differently in that kind of project, and maybe it's there's like any more future of like how this kind of way of working can be implied or like be applied to like other project as well.
Yeah. I think it's another really incredible question, because this is, I think, a misconception about participatory design as kind of like design by committee. And I think instead, actually the tools that all of you learn in studio, which is working through an idea, producing iterations, being able to argue for the kind of the capacities or the affordances and the positives and the negatives of certain versions of a scheme, are all the tools that we use. So as designers, we were always sort of putting forward options or translations of the priorities and conversations that they had, and also occasionally like really curating the kit of parts that we would give them as a kind of design tool. So at a very early stage, we gave them a kit of parts of plan drawings of units, as well as a kind of a set of accompanying images to talk about, how big is a typical closet? How big is a big living room versus a small living room? And kind of let them imagine a sort of Frankenstein unit for themselves that, of course, we then had to turn into viable plans, viable spatial arrangements, and recalibrate their own expectations about what it is that they really wanted as a priority.
And, it's interesting is we've had interesting conversations about doing more projects like this. And I think, Jenny, even talking about, if you want to talk about the Nightingale group, I think there's an interesting way that what it's taught us is that, as we all know, all of you I'm sure know this, that art is applicable at so many different scales, and that we actually can participate in a lot of conversations of the formation of projects and the creation of them. And I think that the two of us are having these conversations about what our role can change there. You want to just talk about Nightingale for a second, because I think it's so interesting.
There's a project called these Nightingale housing complexes in Australia, and they are actually architecture-driven, multifamily combinations of kind of community housing and supportive housing, some of which are
development.
And exactly. They're kind of taking on an entrepreneurial role for the architect as actually the driver of the project, as well as seeing that the value of having the design kind of come first with all of these intentions wrapped into it actually can produce these incredibly successful projects. And we think, you know, that is, we're advocating for all of us to kind of get more credit as the synthesizers of so many more issues than just the kind of mechanics of putting a building together. And in some ways, we're all trained to consider so much more than the mechanics of just putting a building together, that it's a shame that we are kind of not given a little bit more bandwidth and more room to kind of experiment and really test out the potential of those ideas.
Cool. Well, it's pretty much completely on time and on schedule. This is usually, oh, there we are. Hey.
Yeah, so
how are you?
Say hi. You say hi?
Coming into the screen there. Hi. Very sweet. All right. I just want to thank you all, of course, all my students for being here. Our attendees came and a lot disappeared right at the end there. I think they probably didn't understand they could ask questions. I got to work on that. Anyway, awesome, both of you. Really great work. I'm really impressed and happy to see it growing, and, you know, more excitement coming, I'm sure, and really great imagery and awesome graphics. So thank you. And I like the conversation.
So
Super
much.
fun.
Amazing
you.
conversation.
Thank you,
This
guys.
is the best lecture conversation we've ever had.
Oh.
Yep, I agree.
It's the
Honestly.
students. They're awesome. They're awesome. They're awesome. And I like this format. And thank you for the image for the background. All right. Everyone, hey,
thanks,
have a good Passover. Have a good
Be
night.
safe.
Bye. Take care.
All right. Have a good
Bye,
night.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.